Healthcare evidence can be used to ensure that the patient gets the best possible care. However, there's a widely reported gap between clinical practice and the evidence. So why is this? And what can we do to actually tackle that gap and get the knowledge into practice? So as Marisha said, for my PhD, I did a project called Evidence Rounds. It was for healthcare professionals, and the aims were to disseminate the evidence to the healthcare professionals, promote evidence-informed practice, and also to enable and support the implementation of the evidence as well, where appropriate. I'm happy to say that over the 6 sessions and the 6 topics that we looked at for the project, there was actually impact. So some of the evidence was moved into practice. So this is an example of one of the topics that was covered, pre-medication for non-emergency neonatal intubation. This was a topic chosen by the healthcare professionals. They wanted to examine the evidence on this. And these are different impacts that it had. So a guideline was developed. The analgesic and muscle relaxant medications were changed in light of the evidence. There was a training plan for staff developed, and there was also agreement to audit the practice going into the future. So there were other examples of where the evidence was moved into practice. So I thought for today's presentations that I'd take you through 5 tips that I found particularly effective at helping this process. So my tip number 1 is don't expect if and then to happen. So what I mean by this is if there is evidence, it doesn't necessarily mean that healthcare professionals are aware of it. If there is evidence, it doesn't necessarily mean that they'll be able to find and access it. And if there is evidence, it doesn't mean that it will be used. And just going back, obviously health services are very complex institutions, so we have to look at individual level factors, organizational level factors, and also how we can develop an intervention and use a strategy to optimize care for the patient at the end. So my second tip is that the evidence must be fit for purpose. So how much evidence do you have? Do you have a single small study, or do you have lots of studies? And even if you have a lot of information, that doesn't necessarily mean that any decision making that takes place will be any easier. Is the evidence relevant? So if a particular medical treatment is recommended, is it available in Ireland? Is it applicable to your patient cohort? And finally, is it the best available evidence? So you cannot expect healthcare professionals to actually start practicing from evidence that might not be from high quality studies, or if it's from an observational study versus many well conducted multi-center randomized control trials and systematic reviews. So my third tip is be willing to invest in something that may or may not work out. And the something that I'm talking about here is your strategy. So I employed a multi-component strategy, so I kind of knew going in no single component was going to work for everybody. So I did a lot, and I really encouraged feedback from the healthcare professionals. So anytime that something wasn't useful, then we drop it and move on to the next thing. And that was very helpful. So next, these type of initiatives, they're really dependent on contextual factors. As I said, the individual factors, so patient preferences, healthcare professional preferences and values and beliefs, the organizational level factors like how ready is the organization to actually change, and also the intervention. And in terms of adaptation, it's often easier to adapt the intervention, so don't be too precious about trying to predict or control things with the evidence. Just be flexible and responsive. And my fifth tip is to strive for progress, not perfection. And I'd even suggest that there is no perfect initiative for this. I've taken you through tips that have worked for me. It wouldn't necessarily work in bridging the gap in all instances where there is a gap between evidence and practice. And I hope that these tips will be able to inform people who are maybe designing or thinking about going into rolling out initiatives themselves. And thank you very much.